Envision this. Hundreds of soldiers, arms elevated, white fabrics waving in the breeze. Not a single round discharged. Just the noise of footsteps on arid terrain and the gentle buzz of Ukrainian drones hovering overhead. This is not a passage from a historical text. This is unfolding right now in actual time on the front lines of eastern Ukraine. Russian fighters trained, equipped, sent by the Kremlin are deciding to walk away. Not in singles or pairs, in hundreds, in complete platoons, in groups so massive that Ukrainian troops have had to halt military operations just to handle the surge of captives arriving. And here is the inquiry no one in Moscow wants to address. When fighters cease battling, not because they are beaten, but because they decline to perish for a mission they no longer trust in, what does that reveal about the conflict itself? If you have been tracking this war carefully, you know the official Russian storyline. Orderly forces, nationalistic purpose, guaranteed triumph. But the footage emerging out of Doripilia, Chasiv Yar, and the Kursk territory tell a wholly different narrative. And today we are going to examine that narrative. The greatest mass capitulations of this conflict, what caused them, what Ukraine did regarding them, and what they expose about Russia's capacity to sustain combat. This is going to be a thorough one. So ensure you are subscribed to Bradley Madden and have alerts activated so you never skip an analysis such as this. Let's begin where the account is most vivid and most current. Doripilia. It commenced in late August when Russian troops advanced toward a vital roadway near Pokrovsk, pushing nearly 10 kilometers in an effort to sever Ukrainian logistics routes and secure a position in the Donetsk territory. On documents, it appeared like progress. In actuality, it was a snare being constructed. The farther Russian formations advanced, the more they distanced from their own backup. And Ukrainian officers recognized precisely what was occurring. The reaction was rapid and methodical. Ukrainian units, including the 82nd Air Assault, the 93rd Mechanized, and the 1st Azov Corps, acted to surround the overreached Russian formations, retaking settlements like Pankivka and Volyarivka, employing a blend of drone-directed artillery and rapid-moving ground troops. 3 distinct encirclements materialized around Doripilia, confining hundreds of Russian fighters with no feasible escape path. What occurred afterward was a demonstration in psychological operations. Ukrainian drones did not merely monitor positions. They transmitted capitulation directions through speakers and released printed notices into the encirclements below. The communication was straightforward. Put down your arms. Observe these procedures and you will make it. By mid-September, it succeeded. The biggest Russian contingent near Doripilia abandoned the battle. Hundreds of fighters emerged in clusters, arms elevated, some displaying white fabrics, others merely releasing their weapons and moving back. The magnitude was remarkable. Ukrainian troops had to suspend active military engagements just to accommodate the quantity of captives. According to Ukrainian Armed Forces documentation, more than 1,000 Russian fighters had been confirmed eliminated in the wider Doripilia zone since August, establishing it as one of the most violent combat areas of the whole conflict. In one especially intense 72-hour period, 206 fighters were eliminated, 73 injured, and 38 detained. Tanks, transports, and weapon systems fell under Ukrainian possession. The battle line shifted. Territory that Russia had proclaimed a strategic objective became an emblem of disastrous miscalculation. But Doripilia was not a standalone event. If anything, it was the newest installment in a trend that has been developing for months. Roughly a month before the Doripilia engagement reached its climax, something even more striking transpired in Chasiv Yar, a settlement near Bakhmut that has been intensely disputed throughout this conflict. Around July 19th, an entire Russian platoon received what they would subsequently characterize as hopeless directives. According to Ukraine's Central Intelligence Bureau, designated as GR, the fighters were instructed to advance directly into reinforced Ukrainian fortified locations with no cannon backing, no vehicle protection, and no practical probability of surviving intact. They declined. The fighters highlighted the apparent reality. Ukrainian drones were circling above them. Cannons were zeroed on their location. Their sides were unprotected. This was not an operation. This was a termination directive presented as a progression. When their superior reportedly vowed to eliminate anyone who disobeyed, the situation fractured entirely. What ensued was an uprising. The platoon confronted the superior. He was fatally wounded. Colonel Andrei Yusov, representative for Ukraine's GR, spoke about this openly, informing journalists, "What we are witnessing is not singular. Russian fighters deployed as expendable assets are comprehending the conflict as futile, and their existences are being discarded. Some are making the courageous choice to put down weapons, and in some devastating instances, they are revolting against their own superiors." The Chasevir platoon established contact with Ukrainian positions using secure communication protocols and visual signals, then advanced forward with their arms lowered and palms visible. Ukrainian troops acknowledged their capitulation, attended the injured, and transported all of them to security. The consequences were swift and significant. Captured transmissions revealed alarms spreading through adjacent Russian formations. Shock, fury, inquiries that no one in Moscow could resolve. Official channels labeled it a singular breakdown, but the communication intercepts exposed the reality. This was a mental fracture, and intelligence was circulating rapidly. Ukraine promptly leveraged the incident. The recordings of the uprising and resulting capitulation were transmitted directly to neighboring Russian formations. The communication was calculated. Your superiors are more hazardous to you than we are. And for fighters already drained, undersupplied, and doubtful of the conflict's objective, that communication resonated deeply. Now, look back even earlier, because this trend did not originate in 2025. To grasp how extensive the deterioration extends, you must examine what transpired in August 2024 in the Kursk territory, a development that astonished even veteran strategic observers. When Ukrainian Specialized Operations troops crossed the frontier into Kursk Oblast on August 4, 2024, the preliminary Russian reaction was delayed and fragmented. According to Bloomberg's coverage at the moment, a Ukrainian intelligence service formation operating within Russian lands captured 102 Russian military personnel as detainees of conflict within fewer than 24 hours. This was at that juncture the biggest individual capitulation of Russian forces since the comprehensive hostilities commenced. As Bloomberg indicated in its August 15 evening summary, Kyiv was gathering Russian fighters at an impressive rate while concurrently expanding its presence into Russian lands. What rendered the Kursk detentions especially emblematic was who numbered among the captives. Members from the Akhmet formations, the Chechen contingents, long portrayed by Moscow as premier, intimidating units, capitulated in clusters alongside ordinary fighters. Recordings of detained Akhmet members spread extensively online, demolishing the legend Moscow had painstakingly constructed around these contingents. The story of supremacy disintegrated, and it did so openly on camera in actual time. Then arrived December 2024. An attempted Russian advance near Kursk crumbled under Ukrainian defensive barriers and formations of drones. Armored vehicles were demolished. Ground troops were left vulnerable and decimated. Complete platoons reached their limit and appeared displaying white banners. What rendered this situation particularly illuminating was which formations collapsed first: international contingents, notably North Korean combatants that Moscow had recruited to fill vacancies in its weakened formations. According to the Wikipedia chronology of the Kursk operation, by December 2024, the tally of eliminated and injured North Korean combatants had reached several hundred, with South Korea indicating 100 deceased and over 1,000 hurt within the opening weeks of service alone. Inadequate synchronization and linguistic obstacles left these formations perilously exposed. In one disorderly mistaken engagement, North Korean fighters opened rounds on Chechen partners, eliminating 8 and prompting a complete withdrawal. Formations scattered in chaos. The breakdown cascaded through adjacent Russian units and hastened the progression of demoralization that was already substantially ongoing. And before we proceed any further, a brief note. If you are finding worth in this examination, ensure you are subscribed to Bradley Madden. We address the tactical, the governmental, and the personal aspects of this war with the rigor it warrants. Press that subscribe icon and activate the bell. Now, returning to Russia's deterioration. To comprehend why fighters continually make the choice to capitulate, you need to comprehend the framework they are functioning within. And that framework at every tier is disappointing them. Begin with command. Russia's armed forces operate on a hierarchical authority model. When that model is disrupted, the complete mechanism struggles to operate. By middle 2024, thousands of commanders had been lost, including greater than a dozen senior leaders. Replacement commanders, frequently inexperienced and inadequately prepared, were placed into leadership positions they were completely unequipped for. The outcome was precisely what you would anticipate. Directives that had no battlefield rationale, progressions with no backing, locations maintained with no provisions, and fighters who sensed accurately that they were being positioned to perish. A briefing by the UK Ministry of Defence characterized Russian troops as experiencing what it termed persistent discipline problems, malfeasance, and operational exhaustion. Captured transmissions disclosed by Ukraine's Armed Forces Intelligence branch recorded one Russian officer so exasperated at a neighboring formation that he commanded his own fighters to direct rounds at them. The directive transmitted over an unprotected frequency for the 55th target them. That's the formation leader's directive. This is the leadership climate Russian fighters are functioning within. In reaction to escalating abandonment and unwillingness to progress, the Russian Ministry of Defense reportedly stationed what are essentially deterrent formations. Contingents stationed behind combat line troops whose task is to eliminate fighters who withdraw without permission. This method, as documented by South Florida media, referencing GR intelligence, mirrors Stalin's notorious Directive 227 during World War II, not one pace backward. That Russia has turned to intimidating its own fighters with termination to maintain them in the battle reveals everything you must understand about the condition of voluntary commitment in its military. Then there is the I Want to Live initiative established by Ukrainian officials as a direct pathway for Russian fighters looking to capitulate. The project recorded more than 20,000 requests from Russian fighters in 2024 exclusively. According to information released by Ukraine's Coordination Office for the Management of Detainees of Conflict 2025 is demonstrating the greatest capitulation totals since the conflict started. An average of 60 to 90 Russian fighters capitulate every individual week. In August 2024 specifically, the figure climbed to 350 in a solitary week. Since June 2023, Russian troops have been detained more regularly than Ukrainian fighters, a total inversion of prior patterns. The initiative succeeds because it provides something Russia cannot, a believable guarantee of endurance. Drones release pamphlets over Russian locations detailing step by step how to indicate capitulation. Display a white fabric. Employ a designated radio channel. Advance toward Ukrainian positions with palms exposed. Recordings of detained fighters receiving nourishment, healthcare, and telephone conversations home are spread across digital platforms. These recordings circumvent official channels completely and contact Russian fighters directly. The mental effect is quantifiable. Capitulation frequencies have increased after each significant recording publication. Ukraine converted a compassionate process into a tactical instrument. And it was not merely coercion from above. According to an account released by the Kyiv Independent in June 2025, a contingent of Russian fighters who capitulated to Ukrainian airborne troops in the Kursk corridor specifically referenced mistreatment by their own superiors as the explanation they surrendered. Within their formations on the lands of the Russian Federation, they were exposed to degrading conditions, mental coercion, and intimidation. The formal declaration from Ukraine's airborne assault troops stated, "The Insider released an inquiry chronicling Russia's organized employment of what it characterized as detention camp methods within its own armed forces, disciplinary contingents, confinement excavations, and violence adopted directly from Soviet forced labor traditions." For numerous of these fighters, capitulation was not loss. It was liberation. Now, add on top of that the loss statistics. Projections indicate Russia has endured approaching or surpassing 1 million fighters eliminated or injured since February 2022. That total, if correct, surpasses Russia's aggregate losses throughout Afghanistan and both Chechen conflicts. Every morning, fighters observe companions perish to drone attacks, cannon fire, and explosives. New arrivals reach the front line with negligible preparation, sometimes scarcely understanding how to handle their own armaments before being thrust into engagement. The pattern is relentless. Elevated losses generate demand for fresh arrivals. Fresh arrivals are less proficient. Less proficient arrivals generate elevated losses. Continue. The composition of who is battling further undermines spirit. According to information released by Ukraine's Coordination Office, 76% of detained fighters are professional soldiers, many enlisted from Russian correctional facilities. Called-up persons represent 19%, with drafted individuals comprising approximately 5%. A complete 24% indicated being pressured or misled into armed service. The weight of this conflict falls predominantly on males from disadvantaged countryside regions and ethnic minority territories. Buryatia, Dagestan, the Russian Far East. While principal municipalities like Moscow and St. Petersburg stay largely protected from direct enlistment demands, this generates profound bitterness. Fighters on the battle lines recognize that certain existences in Russia hold greater significance than others. And that understanding accumulating across months and years of conflict erodes the determination to battle. Then there is what drone combat has inflicted on the combat zone itself. Approximately 70% of Russia's hardware losses are now linked to Ukrainian drones, according to numerous defense specialists. Ukraine manufactures millions of these platforms yearly. Fighters cannot relocate without being detected. Assaults come with no advance notice, day or evening. Captured transmissions reveal fighters experiencing what officers characterize as drophobia, an authentic, incapacitating fear of the perpetual aerial observation. Formations halt. Fighters desert locations. Not due to frontal engagement, but because they cannot endure another instant under monitoring. Some decline to progress without operational signal disruption backing. When every advancement forward carries immediate detection and an assault from overhead, the logical assessment transforms. Capitulation starts to appear not like defeat, but like the sole reasonable option. The statistics are now so considerable that they have started to reshape Russia's governmental calculations as well. For years, the Kremlin preserved the illusion that this war was advancing as intended. A well-ordered, driven military performing a carefully orchestrated campaign. Mass capitulations make that account unviable to maintain. Recordings of detained fighters, particularly sizable contingents and international combatants, cannot be concealed. They spread on Telegram, on Twitter, on every channel official outlets cannot regulate. Russia's reaction has been a dual-track approach. Suppression domestically and misinformation internationally. Official outlets avoids recognizing substantial capitulations. When surrenders are too visible to dismiss, they are recharacterized as strategic withdrawals or blamed on Western interference or personal treachery. According to coverage from the Kiev Post, Kremlin-affiliated commentators have even asserted without any corroborating proof that Ukraine fabricates counterfeit surrenders employing performers. Independent Russian correspondents who document capitulation events or distribute confirmed recordings of detained fighters face detention, banishment, or worse under comprehensive legislation that criminalizes what Moscow designates the undermining of the armed forces. Complete Telegram networks have been compulsorily removed for sharing recordings that were demonstrably genuine. Meanwhile, the Russian Ministry of Defense has intensified its utilization of posthumous decorations and military burial observances, leveraging the casualties of fighters as messaging to disgrace capitulation and exalt perishing in engagement. The communication from Moscow to its own fighters is unambiguous. If you capitulate, you vanish. If you perish, you become a champion. It is mental warfare aimed not at the adversary, but at one's own personnel. But the approach is revealing its boundaries. Relatives of fighters in territories most affected by conscription are mobilizing. As documented across numerous sources, coalitions reminiscent of the Soldiers' Mothers campaigns that surfaced during the Chechen conflicts are materializing again. Modest, attentively monitored, but outspoken. Appeals are being submitted. Subdued demonstrations are occurring online in closely supervised discussion spaces. Apparent discontent is mounting over the absence of openness about detainees of conflict. The concern is not solely that family members are absent, it is that they are neglected. And that quietness generates resentment even in locations where resentment is risky to voice. Among younger Russians, survey information reveals declining endorsement for the conflict, especially after prominent captive trades where the extent of Russian casualties is challenging to mask. For a regime that depends on engineered agreement and intimidation-driven compliance, even a gradual weakening of domestic readiness to pretend this conflict is logical presents substantial dangers. And the monetary burden intensifies everything. According to evaluation by Germany's external intelligence organization, the BND, Russia's real military expenditure in 2025 was 66% greater than formally announced. As documented by the Jerusalem Post in February 2026, Russia allocated the equivalent of half its complete national budget on its armed forces last year. Euromaidan Press indicated in December 2025 that Russia was consuming roughly $2.7 billion per week on the conflict effort, a sum that, as that publication observed, could support a vast quantity of civilian programs alternatively. According to the Kiev Post referencing evaluation by Janis Kluge of the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, the Kremlin has allocated roughly $532 billion on this conflict since February 2022, a sum comparable to 24 years of investment for Russia's complete advanced education infrastructure. And what is that funding generating? Fighters who capitulate, hardware that winds up in Ukrainian possession, locations that are deserted, new arrivals who come inadequately prepared and frequently do not endure their opening weeks at the front line. As documented by Carnegie Endowment researcher Alexandra Prokopenko in October 2025, Russia is approaching a phase of foundational economic deceleration. Expansion is estimated at around 1%. Price increases remain heightened. The accessible segment of Russia's national wealth fund, the contingency reserve the Kremlin utilized to absorb initial sanctions impacts, has been reduced by greater than half since early 2022. The cushions that absorbed the strain of the conflict's opening 2 years are predominantly depleted. What persists is a wartime fiscal system progressively reliant on internal lending, classified allocation, and concealed instruments that are becoming tougher to preserve. When you combine it all collectively, disintegrated command, mental operations, devastating losses, organized mistreatment, struggling international partners, persistent drone bombardment, and a fiscal system being gutted from the interior, what you observe is not a collection of separate military shortcomings. You observe a framework decaying under its own burden. The historical comparison is not reassuring for Moscow. In the concluding months of World War II, German formations started capitulating in massive quantities, not because they had exhausted their munitions, but because they had exhausted their conviction. Complete division surrendered because the arithmetic of endurance had ultimately surpassed the arithmetic of doctrine. Russia is traveling a comparable path, not yet at the conclusion, but evidently further along that path than the Kremlin is willing to concede. Ukraine, conversely, is progressing in the contrary trajectory. With continued Western defense and monetary backing, its troops are growing more seasoned, more technically advanced, and more tactically nimble with every month that elapses. The distinction is pronounced. One faction's military is declining in spirit, command, and equipment capability. The other's is processing difficult experiences and implementing them. And Ukraine has converted the capitulation trend itself into a capability enhancer. Every detainee secured is a prospective trade resource, influence in discussions, verification of combat superiority, and a tangible illustration that selecting existence over a hopeless engagement is achievable. Since the beginning of the comprehensive hostilities, Ukraine has recovered more than 3,000 of its own fighters through detainee trades. The trades are scheduled purposefully, frequently following significant Russian setbacks intended to convey a communication to Ukrainian troops still engaging. You are not overlooked. These transfers are not merely compassionate gestures. They're tactical declarations. The recordings of Russian detainees being handled with respect and provided nourishment and healthcare is counterintuitively one of Ukraine's most powerful persuasion instruments for capitulation. Every recording of a detained Russian fighter placing a telephone conversation home, breathing and unharmed, contacts other Russian fighters and introduces a consideration. Why am I still positioned here? What am I accomplishing this for? Who truly gains from my elimination? Those considerations circulating quietly through formations are more destructive to Russian military unity than any artillery volley. Here is what all of this indicates when you withdraw to the broadest conceivable perspective. Conflicts are ultimately resolved when one faction can no longer maintain the determination to persist. Land, hardware, and losses all count. But they count because of what they produce for that foundational element, the readiness to continue battling. Russia is hemorrhaging that readiness from numerous angles concurrently. Its fighters are expressing through their actions, elevated empty, capitulating in quantities that are expanding year after year. Its fiscal system is being reorganized around a conflict it cannot bear to forfeit, but additionally cannot bear to maintain permanently. Its internal storyline is fracturing gradually but perceptibly under the mass of casualties too substantial and too genuine to entirely conceal. None of this indicates the conflict is concluded. Russia maintains an enormous traditional armed force, considerable territory, and a governmental framework capable of maintaining compulsion even as voluntary drive disintegrates. The hostilities will persist, and it will stay catastrophic for everyone trapped within it. But the direction is evident, and it is inscribed in the expressions of the individuals emerging from Doripilia with their palms in the atmosphere. To completely appreciate how we reached here, you must return to September 2022 to the Kharkiv counterattack. According to Ukraine's Coordination Office, Russia has declined for the fourth sequential year to engage in a comprehensive, all-inclusive trade arrangement. The disparity is significant. Ukraine employs its detainees tactically. Russia employs theirs reluctantly or not whatsoever. This is Bradley Madden. If today's examination provided you a sharper understanding of where this war is truly progressing, subscribe to the channel and distribute this recording with someone who deserves to comprehend what is genuinely occurring on the battlefield, not what official channels wants them to accept. We will continue observing, continue examining, and continue delivering you the comprehensive account. Thanks for joining us.